All right. Hello and welcome to episode 87 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And just in case you can't see me because of me wearing this camo shirt, I'm right in the middle of the screen. If you look very carefully, you should be able to see me. We got lots of questions, more than the usual number, so this is almost certainly going to be well above 2 hours long. And so I advise you all to pause this video right now and go potty and then come back and watch the video because it's going to be a while. I have this feeling. So without any further ado, I'm going to start answering questions. And the first question is from Mara Maid Mahayana, also known as Bodhisattva 969. And Mara Maid Mahayana says, I recently had a discussion with my Thai wife and stepdaughter about the sila of no killing. I asked them why many lay followers in Thailand take the five silas in the temple but then kill fish at home, for example. They told me something like it's important not to kill for fun, and in parentheses he's got intention, and that I would eat meat myself. I have to say, I find this hypocritical attitude of the cultural Buddhists in Thailand very annoying because the Buddhist teachings are actually crystal clear, and the Buddha ate meat but didn't kill. Anyone who wants to hunt or butcher is welcome to do so, but not to take on the five silas. Is it the same in Myanmar? Well, it's fairly similar in Myanmar. The Burmese are more conservative and traditionalist than the Thais, who have taken on much more modern and postmodern Western culture. And I think the Thais have in general been a more sensual kind of people than the Burmese, who are very stoic or Spartan in their approach to life. But yeah, there's always going to be this kind of stuff in just about any religion, too, I might add. Like Christianity, the Bible is very clear that, I mean, you can't get married and then get divorced and then get married again. It just doesn't work that way, but I mean, it happens all the time. Or Christianity, it says, gather not up your treasures upon the earth. It warns again and again and again against being rich, how you should be poor. But of course, Christians don't like that part, and so they conveniently ignore it as a general rule. So I've lived in places in Burma like when I was living in a forest monastery between Lay Mye village and One Bo village on the shores of the Chindwin River. The people there were relatively very, very serious about keeping sila. A lot of them really did keep five precepts. So they'd be very careful not to eat fertile eggs, fertile chicken eggs, that kind of a thing. And I remember one of my main supporters, her family was just scandalized and shamed because her brother married the daughter of a fisherman. And of course, a fisherman kills animals for a living. It's very un-Buddhist. And so it was very sort of low class, just sort of a low status kind of a person that would be not only a fisherman, but even the daughter of a fisherman. But even so, I mean, there's lots of people in Burma who think that you just get merit for taking five precepts, even if you have no intention of keeping all five. So this sort of thing does happen, maybe not quite so much as in Thailand, but it's going to happen just because of human nature being what it is. It happens in all religions all over the world. And so, I mean, it's also just a law of economics that if you can make money by doing something, there's going to be people doing it. So if there's no convenient Muslims in the village who are the village butcher, there's going to be a Buddhist person who is the village butcher because people are going to eat meat, at least on festival days. That's usually when Burmese villagers eat the most meat, is essentially festival days. So it does happen. It's not exactly the same, because Myanmar is not exactly the same as Thailand. But I mean, this kind of thing is going to happen. You're born into a religion, but you're not really spiritually inclined. You just go through the motions just because it's the culture, and you're going to not really take it very seriously, or you're just going to fudge on certain things that are very inconvenient for you to follow, and it's just human nature. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is also from Mara Maid Mahayana, which is, can one briefly say that all teachings or means of Buddhism, such as anapanasati, mindfulness, etc., aim at recognizing the non-self through dependent arising, quenching the thirst for becoming, and in parentheses he's got tanha, and thus putting an end to suffering through new arising in samsara? Can one briefly say it? I'm not so sure how briefly one can say it, but I mean, you could interpret Buddhism that way. There's lots of different ways of interpreting Buddhism. You can say that the purpose of Buddhism is to eliminate dukkha, which is in the texts many times. You can say that the purpose of Buddhism is to eliminate delusion. So, I mean, that's just as true, even though it's a different way of looking at it. You can say that the purpose of Buddhism is to cause one to, see the three marks of existence clearly and to eliminate one's hindrances and so forth. I mean, there's different ways of interpreting the same thing. So you could say that all of them aim at recognizing non-self through dependent arising, quenching the thirst for becoming, and thus putting an end to suffering through new arising in samsara, or through, maybe he meant no new arising in samsara, or no arising in samsara. So yeah, I mean, there's just different ways that you can interpret it, and they're all equally valid. I mean, there's lots of invalid ways of interpreting it too, but there isn't just one way of explaining, the purpose of Dhamma, like even the highest purpose. Lower purpose, as most practicing Buddhists aren't even attempting to stop being reborn, because a lot of people, most people want to continue being alive, and so they're mainly just earning merit so that they can be rich and beautiful in their next life, or maybe even be a small g god in heaven, that sort of thing. So I think I answered that one too. So that's 2 in a row I've answered. So I'm going to move on to the next one, also from Mara Maid Mahayana. And he says, the Thai Netflix series Believers also deals with the topic of corrupt Buddhism, or at least that's how it seems to me. Among other things, it's about a forest monk who becomes a city monk and therefore has to accept gifts of money and perform a number of rites. The Buddha himself called not adhering to rituals and rites a sign of a stream enterer or sotapanna. How can a Buddhist country simply ignore so many of the Buddha's instructions? Now I understand your stubbornness as a monk. Such misinterpretation and hypocrisy always really annoys me. Well, this question is very similar to the first question, because, a lot of it still, it's like this part, how can a Buddhist country simply ignore so many of the Buddha's instructions? I mean, it's the same in any religion, especially a relatively advanced religion that is hard to follow. So, of course, like most Christians aren't going to sell all they have, give the money to the poor, and just take up their cross and start wandering the earth, casting out demons and healing the sick. I mean, most Christians couldn't do that even if they wanted to, or they couldn't want to, which amounts to the same thing. And it's the same way in Buddhism too. He mentions something up here. See, among other things, it's about a forest monk who becomes a city monk and therefore has to accept gifts of money. Well, actually, he doesn't have to accept gifts of money. I mean, he could just be a hard-nosed monk and refuse to accept gifts of money. I mean, that's an option. I mean, he might get kicked out of the monastery by lax monks who resent him, like supposedly trying to make them look bad. Because that's how a lot of lax monks will interpret a strict monk, who lives at their monastery, they'll just grumble against him and say he's just showing off. He's just trying to make himself look good so he can be famous. He's trying to make us look bad because of, pernicious motives or whatever. But if he's a serious monk, then he won't accept gifts of money. And performing a number of rites, that's neither good nor bad. Some serious monks will perform rites. Especially if they're not hermits living out in the forest, if they're living in a village or a town, they'll be officiating at funerals, for example, or, they'll just be giving the precepts and the three refuges, like especially on Uposatha days, the full moon, the new moon, and the half moon days. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. So let's see here. Corrupt Buddhism. Yeah, well, Buddhism is corrupt. Even Theravada Buddhism is corrupt in various ways, and pretty much all religions are corrupt to some degree or another. So I guess I answered that one too. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pranav. And Pranav says, could you give the chronology of your father's past lives? And I've mentioned some of my father's past lives. I think it was the previous Q&A I mentioned one of his past life regressions. And I wrote a blog post giving some details about my father's past lives as he recalled them as the result of hypnotic past life regressions. So my father was an amateur hypnotist, among other things. He was definitely an explorer in the realm of the occult, just experimented with lots of things, just trying to understand the limits of the human mind, or maybe learning that ultimately there are no limits, that kind of a thing. And I can just sort of give a rough chronology of the ones that I know about. He didn't claim to know all of them. He only seemed to remember about 5 or 6 past lives. But there was one that somebody asked a question about this. It's the third question, Pranav's third question. But my father specifically wanted to remember like the earliest past life that he could possibly remember. And he just remembered being very small and looking. He was in a deep forest and looking through some palm fronds, or not palm fronds, like fern fronds. And the sunlight was filtering through the forest, and just sort of everything was all kind of sparkly and golden where the light was shining through. And he was just fascinated by that. And that was like the earliest memory of a past life that he was able to extend his memory back into. Or, if you want to be somewhat skeptical or cynical, you could say it's, his imagination, his subconscious imagination coming to the surface while in a hypnotic trance. Because there's no way to prove. How are you going to prove that is really a past life regression? So anyways, then another one of his past lives was presumably the Roman soldier that I described. I think it was the previous Q&A, where he specifically wanted to know what would be the turning point in his series of incarnations, where it was like the turning point that caused him to go into the direction that led to where he is today. And that was, he was some kind of ancient soldier. I'm guessing Roman, because he had a little sword like this, and they were at war with blonde-haired barbarians, presumably Germanic. And he spared the life of a teenage boy in that village just through compassion. And then later on, he felt guilt for not doing his duty and killing the teenage boy, and went out looking for him but didn't find him. But even so, even though he regretted it afterwards, still that was like the first genuine compassion, or at least the most significant compassion that really started to shift his perspective on life and, his position among all the other conscious beings in his world. So that would be another ancient one. And the one that he remembered the best was a Scotsman named Jason Haskell, who according to him, probably lived in like the 1700s or maybe very early 1800s. And he was a sailor. Um, he did some exploring. In fact, he died like in the foothills of the Himalayas somewhere. He was on like a surveying party or something, and he picked up. I mean, they're on horseback going through this trail through the hills, and he sees a little like a brass pot lying by the side of like sitting on the by the side of the path, and he wants to pick it up. One of the guides tells him, "Don't mess with that. Like a shaman put that there to collect rainwater for some purpose. Don't touch it." But he picked it up as a souvenir, put it in his saddlebags, and they continued on their way. And then a little later, when they're setting up camp, he's bending over to put the saddle of his horse onto a stump or something, and an arrow came out of the bushes and caught him underneath the shoulder blade and came out his neck. And then he would always wake up from the trance just coughing and choking. That would just snap him out of the trance whenever he'd do that regression. I don't know how many times he did it. But that was one of the ones that he remembered the best. He had a lot of memories from his life as Jason Haskell. Then he had another life after that, like late 1800s, that he can barely recall at all. But he was a crazy Frenchman named Henri Moreau, who was hanged by the neck for rustling cattle in early Montana territory. And then he became my dad. And there might be one or two that I'm just not recalling, but those are the main past lives that my father claimed to remember. He also had a lot of strange memories of like astral traveling and so forth, but Pranav didn't ask about that, and we got lots and lots of questions. So I'm just going to move on to Pranav's second question here, which is, how can I have more virya as an indriya and also as a parami? Because I think I am very lazy and it is affecting my life. Well, in order to translate that into English, how can I have more virya? Virya means like energetic effort, like heroic effort. The word virya in Pali has the same Proto-Indo-European etymology as the word virile in English, or like the triumvirate in Latin or anglicized Latin. So it literally, like vir literally means like man. Vira means like hero, like Mahavira, the reputed founder of Jainism. I mean, Mahavira literally translates into English as great hero. So it's like heroic effort or just manly effort, just energy, strenuousness, ardor, vigor, that kind of a thing. And indriya generally means faculty. There are 5 indriyas or 5 faculties, and virya is one of them. And also parami is literally means something like perfection. And there are 10 paramis in Theravada Buddhism, and virya is one of those. See, it's parami number 5. So how can you have more energy because you think you're too lazy? Well, that's a tough one, because I mean, in order to change your behavior, you have to change your perceptions. So it could be that just reflecting on the fact that you're going to die someday. I mean, that's like a standard early Buddhist treatment for laziness is just, read suttas that emphasize the inevitability of death, for example. Or, I mean, for me, one thing that helped to cure me of laziness for a while, at least when I was a relatively young monk, was going to see autopsies, although that may not work for Pranav. It may not be possible to do that wherever he is living right now. But I mean, when you up close, that looking at a dead person, then really it's like a kick in the ass. It's like you don't want to waste time. It's like life is precious, It's a rare opportunity to be born as a human, especially a rare opportunity to be born as a human who has the opportunity to hear Dhamma. And so, yeah, you shouldn't be wasting what limited time you've got. At least that's the official position in Theravada Buddhism. It does make perfect sense, although I'm lazy too. So, I mean, if you're lazy and you want to work that into your practice, I mean, meditate a lot, because when you're meditating, you're just sitting there. You know, you're essentially motionless while you're meditating, and that's a pretty lazy thing to do in a way. So, I mean, you can turn your laziness to your advantage through just sitting on your butt, meditating, or sitting on your butt, studying Dhamma, that kind of a thing. And if you just sit on your butt doing other things instead, then it may not be that laziness is so much the problem as just a lack of motivation. And again, just reading suttas that are like motivational suttas, like the discourse on arousal in the Sutta Nipata. That's a good one. There's quite a few suttas in the Sutta Nipata that are good for just sort of overcoming inertia, just getting you sort of fired up. So, I mean, in fact, some of them are just discourses on how early monks lived their lives, which can just shame you into trying harder, because the way monks were living their lives in the Buddhist time and shortly after the Buddhist time, I mean, they were they were really going for it. And they weren't, it wasn't that they were super energetic. You know, they might just be wandering around and just sitting on their butt motionless most of the time. But still, I mean, they were taking Dhamma very seriously and just enduring hardships and so forth, being very Spartan and stoic and so forth. So you might try that. But I'm kind of lazy myself, so I shouldn't be preaching too much about not being lazy. So I'll just move on to Pranav's next question. And this is sort of a follow-up on his first question. And it is, in your blog about your father's past lives, at the end of your father wanted, at the end of it, your father wanted to go as far as he could and remember the earliest memory from a past life still accessible. He was regressed to a shady green past. Your father was feeling very small and looking up through fern fronds at the play of sunlight on the forest greenery. What life could that be? Apes? Some kind of animal? And tell your hypothesis about it. Well, I actually asked my father about this back in the day when he was still alive, and I was probably a teenager at the time. You know, he was telling me about that, and I asked him, you know, it's like, well, I mean, were you like a cave person? Were you a little kid? Were you an animal? And he said he didn't know, because it's just a very dim, like the most distant memory he could salvage, or you know, the most distant memory he could dredge up, and it's very dim, very hazy, and he just got that one little image. And so even he didn't know what he was, who he was, anything like that. He just remembers just sort of like the mesmerized fascination of watching the light sparkling in the forest as it's filtered through the tree canopy. So who knows? Even my father didn't know. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Mooners. And Mooners says, do you feel bad when you drink alcohol because of how the Buddha regarded alcohol consumption? Well, there's a number of things I can say about this. First of all is no, I don't feel bad when I drink alcohol because of how the Buddha regarded alcohol consumption. And the main reason for that is, if you're going to do something, you shouldn't feel guilty about what you're doing, because feeling guilty just makes it worse. It just adds to the badness, adds to the bad karma, so to speak. And I've preached about this. I've said, if you only know two things about Dhamma, only two things. One is, whenever you're unhappy, it's because you are desiring something. And two, regret or remorse is always a bad thing. It's always an unwholesome mental state. It always makes bad karma. So I've taken that to heart. And so I'm not going to drink a beer and then just like feel regret while I'm drinking it. I mean, what would be the point? However, sometimes I do feel bad when I drink alcohol because sometimes I get acid reflux at night. So if I can just drink like one beer shortly before going to bed, and I'll just be like burping stomach acid up into my throat for hours after that. That has happened a few times. So it's that kind of feeling bad. I've had slight hangovers even, and I'm really a lightweight now. Maybe it's because when you get older, it's like your system can't process alcohol as easily. I can just have like 3 drinks and over the course of an evening, and wake up the next morning with like a semi hangover, just feeling not quite right due to acetaldehyde poisoning or whatever it is. So, also with regard to how the Buddha regarded alcohol consumption, I mean, it wasn't really an emphatic thing. I mean, it's the 5th precept. You know, you don't take, what is it, ale, wine, or other intoxicants which cause cloudedness of mind or heedlessness. So, but it's like the 5 precepts were just sort of a system set up for lay people to give the lay people, you know, something to engage themselves to and to improve their lives. And it was just a standard thing in the Buddha's time in northern India that pretty much all these systems had 5 precepts for lay people. The Jains had 5 precepts. The Brahmins even had 5 precepts for lay people. And the 5th precept varied. The first 4 precepts were pretty steady, but the 5th one, like in Buddhism, it was, you know, the intoxicant thing. I think in Jainism, it was actually having personal property, which is kind of communistic, it seems. And I don't remember what the Brahmin fire worshippers, the Jatilas, what their 5th precept was for lay people. So I mean, I really don't think that it's immoral to have a beer. I just don't see that. I mean, if I were like really like a hardcore dogmatic Buddhist who just followed everything just because it says so in the books or just because it's the tradition or whatever, then yeah, I wouldn't drink alcohol. But I do occasionally have a drink. I had like 1.5 apple ciders last night, in fact. Didn't get drunk, but sometimes I just like to drink something like that. So, yeah, I do occasionally drink alcohol, though I don't think people would be inclined to call me a drunkard, and I'm certainly not an alcoholic. But just in answer to the question, it's just traditional for me to give very long answers to short questions. So, do I feel bad when I drink alcohol because of how the Buddha regarded alcohol consumption? The answer is no. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Fred, who sometimes goes by the alias of Alfred. And he says, I don't know, sometimes with Fred's questions, you can't really tell if he's really asking a question or not, because sometimes he just like puts question marks at the end of sentences almost at random. So one comment under a YouTube video, I think it was, he says, "This enlightenment word is problematic, question mark." And yeah, it is somewhat problematic. Like I mentioned in a previous Q&A, a relatively recent one, the Dignaga school of Buddhism, who are sometimes called the Yogacara logicians. And their classic example of a problematic premise in logic is the existence of enlightened beings. You know, it's there in the text. The Buddha himself was an enlightened being, you know, according to Buddhism, but still, I mean, there's no way to prove it. And within the context of samsara, which is where logic is, which is where, you know, reason and just perception in general is, I mean, it's just off the scale. It's not within the realm of samsara. That enlightenment is, it transcends samsara. And so within the context of samsara, I do think that enlightenment is sort of a paradox at best. I'm not saying that it just doesn't exist, but essentially it's a problematic premise. But it is pretty obvious that some people are closer to enlightenment than others. And so it may be that you have to get close. I mean, it's sort of like how meditation works. For the sake of getting enlightened, it's like it's traditional in certain texts. Anyway, it seems to have been a tradition in ancient India that fourth jhana was like the jumping off point to enlightenment. And fourth jhana is just like your mind is just flat calm. It's the perfection of mindfulness. You're not unconscious at all. It's considered to be the perfection of mindfulness. So you are perfectly mindful when you're in fourth jhana, even though it may look like you're in a complete trance or some such. But it's like your mind, your perceptions aren't functioning. I mean, you've stopped perceiving. And in a way, because perception is samsara and all delusion is perceptual, then you have temporarily through fourth jhana ceased being deluded. And it's sometimes it's called temporary liberation in the texts. It's like sort of like a taste of enlightenment, but then you start perceiving again and you're back in the delusion again. So it may be that some people need like a more silent mind in order to transcend the delusion. They may have to completely stop the perceptions in order to transcend perceptions, but other people, they may not need fourth jhana. They may be able to become enlightened in like choppy seas. They can still have the perception going. And at any rate, once you become enlightened, the idea is that even when you're back in the choppy seas and you're perceiving and thinking again, you're still transcending it. You're no longer taking it seriously. You're no longer identified with it. And so enlightenment could be kind of like that, where you may not seem like you're enlightened, but still, you've transcended it. It's all the weird human stuff, this human nature stuff, human, all too human. It can still be going on, and you may be acting like you're not particularly wise, but it may be that some people, they don't have to get to this stage of purified sainthood in order to transcend samsara. And so in a case like that, I mean, how are you going to be able to tell if anyone's enlightened? I mean, obviously, some people are just pretty obviously unenlightened. But, I mean, there's no way to really prove that anyone is enlightened. So to that extent, it is problematic. And to the extent that enlightenment, in a sense, transcends samsara, and any kind of proof is going to be samsaric. Any kind of evidence is going to be samsaric. So, yeah, it's hard to talk about this stuff. So I'm going to move to Fred's next question here, which is, can an arahant be affected by brain fluid malfunction? For example, Ajahn Chah, from path leader to a vegetable. In my opinion, the mind is not apart from the body. Well, it seems like Fred is assuming the reality of physical matter, which is understandable. Even Orthodox Theravada assumes the reality of physical matter, although most Mahayana schools eventually did away with it. And yeah, whether Ajahn Chah was enlightened or not, I don't know. He was very wise, but it is true that he was like a vegetable due to, I think it was diabetes, that he just became like a vegetable, like confined to a wheelchair, just kind of slobbering on himself for several years before he finally died. So, so whether Ajahn Chah was an arahant that became like a vegetable, I don't know. So it's all very problematic. I mean, if just the existence of enlightened beings is like paradoxical or problematic or abhyakada, what's the indeterminate? Yeah, I mean, the mind of an enlightened being would be indeterminate. So yeah, something like Ajahn Chah, I've wondered about that. It's like maybe, I mean, it was just like his spirit, so to speak, attained its parinibbana while this body just vegetated. I mean, according to Theravada, the body has to die, I think. But I mean, if you're brain dead, or I mean, it's just like, there's nobody there anymore, then it may be that even if you're not enlightened, I mean, your consciousness, your karma has already moved on to somebody else. In fact, Ian Stevenson, who wrote a book, he wrote a number of books about like empirical evidence supporting the idea of rebirth. He referred to one Thai monk who recalled his previous life, and it certainly was not Orthodox Theravada because he had already taken rebirth as a baby while the person that he was in the previous life was still alive, like, unconscious in a hospital bed. So I think I might be veering away from the gist of Fred's question. Can an arhat be affected by brain fluid malfunction? Yeah, I mean, how can you really say? I mean, they might appear to be affected, but whether, I mean, their enlightenment is affected or not is a whole other question. And if they really are enlightened, then it doesn't really matter what appears to be going on at the superficial samsaric level. I mean, they're still enlightened. I don't think they'd become roaring drunk or any such thing. They'd still be enlightened. They wouldn't have these repressed urges like just bubbling up to the surface and running amok like some drunks do. I mean, I've met some people that they're just very quiet, mild-mannered, nice people, and then they just become ugly drunks. And my theory is it's sort of like Freud with the repressed urges. They just in the habit of repressing their urges, and then they get drunk enough, and the repression just fails, and they're just like spewing all this stuff that they've been holding back all this time. And some people, I think, become addicted to that. They have to use the drunkenness or whatever drug it is or whatever it is as a kind of pressure release valve to keep them from exploding. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Tig, and Tig is an irreverent guy who usually asks joke questions. So let's see. The first one from Tig is, what is the largest amount of food you've ever consumed in one sitting? And I don't really know. I mean, who keeps track of this? I mean, when I was a junior monk, I ate from that bowl on the table back there, which holds well over a gallon. And I could eat like 3/4 of that bowlful, approximately a gallon of food. And I was still skinny. Of course, the food wasn't extremely nutritious. It was mostly like white rice, like bananas and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. It might be Italian food. It's for some reason I've got a hollow leg when it comes to Italian food. I could eat like a large pizza just without really trying. If that is, if I was like inclined towards gluttony, which I usually am not, and didn't want to save any for breakfast or lunch the next day. But I don't know. Who keeps track of this stuff? So then the next question from Tig is, are there alien bases on the moon? And I have no idea. I have seen zero evidence that indicates that there are alien bases on the moon. It wouldn't really surprise me, I guess. They might put it on the back side of the moon so it's less conspicuous if they're really here to observe us, as like anthropologists or something. But I have seen zero evidence to suggest that there are alien bases on the moon, other than maybe New Age channelers declaring it, through some entity that's supposedly speaking through them, or maybe, psychics who have remote viewing of the alien base on the moon. But I do not consider them to be reliable sources of information. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is also from Tig. Is a plastic Chinese woman who has or doesn't have deformed feet evidence of conspicuous consumption? And this is based on a number of kind of inside jokes, or just information that most of you viewers will not have access to. But Tig seems to have this strange fascination for posting on a Buddhist Discord server this numerous pictures of obviously airbrushed, modified young Chinese women. He seems to just have this fascination for plastic-looking young Chinese women. And also, he was asking for suggestions on economics books to read. So one of the only economics books I've ever read was The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen. So I suggested he read that. And it's based on conspicuous consumption. This book by Thorstein Veblen, The Theory of the Leisure Class, it was written over 100 years ago, I'm sure. He's talking about how in early human society, everyone knew everybody else. Everyone knew the relative position of the other, everyone else that they knew, in the hierarchy. They knew who the chief was. They knew who the village drunk was. It was like nobody had to put on airs. Nobody had to wear special uniforms or anything. Everybody knew everybody else's position. But as we became urbanized and got higher population density, then it wasn't obvious. You didn't know everybody else in town. And so people had to start like displaying their social status. And shortly after that, almost simultaneous with that, people started faking higher social status than they already had. And a lot of things like weird manners, like knowing what kind of wine goes with veal, or how to eat a banana in public, or just weird uniforms, like why Roman Catholic bishops and cardinals and the Pope himself wear the funny hats and the cloth of gold. Like Greek Orthodox patriarchs are the same way. I mean, they look kind of like Santa Claus, except they're just like encrusted with jewels. And Thorstein Veblen explains all this in accordance with the theory of conspicuous consumption. And he mentions deformed feet on Chinese women because I can't remember if it was mentioned specifically in the book, but it fits the theory perfectly that Chinese foot binding, where Chinese girls, especially the ones that were of the middle class or upwards, would have their feet bound tightly when they were little so that their feet couldn't get much bigger than about like this. And when they were full grown, they could hardly hobble around. But it was a sign of social status. And it was a sign of social status not only for the woman, but for the man who married her, because he was obviously displaying to all his neighbors he could afford to marry a woman who was good for nothing other than ornamentation and the bedroom. That his wife didn't have to work for a living. In fact, she couldn't work for a living even if she wanted to. Unless maybe she's sitting there with an abacus figuring out accounts or something. So, getting back to the question after all this explanation, so that you can even understand more or less the more or less joke question of Tig here. Is a plastic Chinese woman who has or doesn't have deformed feet evidence of conspicuous consumption? No, not really. I mean, to have like a trophy wife is kind of a sign of conspicuous consumption, but just a plastic Chinese woman, I mean, what's the conspicuous consumption in that? I just don't see it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Newman, spelled N-U-M-E-N, Newman. And Newman says, do you have any recommendations on books to read on how Buddhism deals with the military or violence and its precepts regarding warfare? I read Zen at War and am wondering if there were similar developments in Theravada Southeast Asian Buddhism, but in general, any book recommendations on Buddhism and war? And I mean, Theravada Buddhism is really uncompromising. It's very clearly, war is essentially mass murder. And it's just something that is a worldly thing. You can't really get rid of it. Sort of like, killing animals for meat, or in those days also slavery. It's stuff that is just a part of society, And you deal with that if you're a serious Buddhist, you're a serious Dhamma practitioner by renouncing society. You go off alone in the forest. You go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros, sit at the roof of a tree and strive for enlightenment. So, I mean, there was lots of war in the Buddhist time, and sometimes he would, do his best to dissuade like aggressive tribes from warring with each other. But he did, according to legend, come from the military caste. He was a kshatriya of the warrior class. So he presumably had military training when he was younger. But it really is uncompromising, like a monk. You've got warrior monks in feudal Japan. Warrior monks were a thing. You had Buddhist monks, mostly of Pure Land schools or Shinran or something, who, I mean, they were masters at killing. They martial arts experts. Experts at firing the new invention of firearms. But in Theravada Buddhism, they don't really have anything. Like the closest I can think of with regard to militaristic Theravada might be something like ancient or medieval Sri Lanka, when kings, like Buddhist Sinhalese kings, were trying to unify the people against the Hindu Tamils that were invading the island. So sometimes it would get turned into Buddhists versus Hindus, or Sinhalese versus Tamils. It was more of a cultural, and to some degree racial, but I think it was more of a cultural conflict that would be used for propaganda purposes to unify the Sinhalese against the Tamils. But whether there was any actual books justifying it, I mean, they wouldn't be Buddhist books really. It wouldn't be written by, I mean, maybe some Buddhist monks were on the bandwagon, but I've never actually heard of it in Theravada Buddhism. So, I mean, in the Patimokkha rules for monks are forbidden to visit an army. That you can't go to a battlefield, you can't see armies on maneuvers, you can't go to see armies in full array, where they're on parade or anything like that. Monks are forbidden to even go look at that. You're not supposed to have anything to do with it, because essentially it's organized mass murder. So, yeah, I haven't ever come across a book on military Buddhism. I know there's a lot of emphasis on it in certain circles. There are some fascistic types who they like the idea of Buddhism being an Aryan religion. It's like an Indo-European, authentically Indo-European spiritual tradition. So they like that part, but it's just not violent enough for them. It's not aggressive enough. It's not Nietzschean enough for them. And so they're looking for authorities justifying Buddhists killing other people. And I mean, you might find some of this in the chronicles, like the Mahavamsa, or the Deepa Vamsa. Some of the early chronicles, like the Sinhalese chronicles, where it's discussing war, and there would be some monks who would be justifying killing Tamils because if you're not a Buddhist, you're just not really human, this kind of stuff. But I mean, it's not genuine Dhamma. It's just sort of politics infiltrating religion. And I mean, maybe in Zen it started becoming more philosophical, but militaristic Theravada, I mean, any philosophy at all would hardly get past the level of sophistry. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to learn about militant Buddhism, your best bet would be Suzuki Roshi, DT Suzuki. He was on the side of the Japanese during World War II. He justified the Bushido, the code of the warrior and all that. So, and like I was saying, like warrior monks have been a thing in Japan for hundreds of years. So they would have like a tradition, and probably it would have been refined into some more or less philosophical systems, more or less justifying warfare. Although one of the most profound justifications for warfare that I've come across is in the Bhagavad Gita. And in a way, the Bhagavad Gita I've read was part of its purpose was as an argument against Buddhism. But yeah, there is sort of some spiritual justification of fighting and killing in the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, the whole Mahabharata is based on a war. The whole Sanskrit epic of the Mahabharata is about a great war. But I mean, it's been turned into like an allegory, but still, there's a lot of real military stuff in there. So yeah, I'd check out Japanese stuff, like the Zen stuff, like Suzuki Roshi's stuff, and there are a number of other proponents of militant Zen. I mean, in fact, it's like an unofficial koan at the end of the Mumonkan was composed by a samurai warrior. And so, I mean, there's no reason why you can't be good at koans and meditation and so forth and be like a samurai warrior at the same time. Like Rinzai Zen was called samurai Zen, whereas Soto Zen was called like peasant Zen or farmer Zen, because Rinzai Zen was more popular with the upper classes, which of course in Japan consisted largely of the samurai class. So again, your best bet will be to look towards Japanese literature or literature about Japan. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, how very old bhikkhus are treated in Myanmar? Well, Burma still has a traditional culture, a traditional wisdom culture. And they have genuine respect for elders, which is generally the way it is in like old-fashioned conservative traditional cultures. For example, at one Lemye village that I mentioned a little earlier, every year they'd have a festival in celebrating and honoring everybody above the age of 70 in the village. They'd be like bowing to them, offering them gifts and providing them with a feast, just out of respect for their elders. And it's the same with monks. Monks are treated like really old monks that are just bedridden and so forth. They'll have, at the very least, they'll have a novice or a junior monk who's assigned to be taking care of them, and they're taken care of conscientiously. I never saw like a really neglected, badly treated old monk. They're generally treated with respect. And monks in general are treated with respect. Elders in general are treated with respect. So elder monks, even if they're like in late stage senility or just bedridden, they're still treated with respect and are treated well. So I'll just move on to Nature Cure's next question here, which is, if a layperson had Nirodha experience once, should he get ordained as bhikkhu or better stay as a layman? Well, Nirodha here means cessation. It's Nirodha Samapati, or in the longer term, or Nirodha Samapati means the attainment of cessation, and it's the cessation of perception and feeling, which in Orthodox Theravada means you're essentially just in stasis. You're like in a state of suspended animation. You wouldn't even be able to remember having been in this state. But I think maybe originally in Buddhism, it was possible to still be conscious even though perception and feeling had temporarily stopped. In which case, you might still experience this state. But according to Orthodox tradition again, only very highly advanced saints are even capable of attaining it. So if a layperson experienced Nirodha Samapati, Yeah, I would be very skeptical that a layperson really attained that. Or if they did, they would be a very unusual layperson. But for the most part, they probably experienced something other than that and then identified it as Nirodha Samapati. I mean, you can get into meditative states where everything seems to stop. And it may be that a state like that might be misidentified as Nirodha Samapati. But Nirodha Samapti itself is a problematic term that I take it with a grain of salt, sort of like Sotapanna also, because I think the original meaning may not be the official meaning now. You know, it's like the meaning has changed over time as the official position of the doctrine has changed over time. You know, as the system got developed into a wada, you know, Theravada, a doctrine of the elders. You know, it's not true that the Buddha was teaching orthodox Theravada. The orthodox Theravada gradually developed, as all these other ancient schools of Buddhism also gradually developed from what the Buddha originally taught. And some of them are more conservative than others, like the Buddhist historian, not K.R. Norman, A.K. Warder was saying that Theravada was one of the three most conservative ancient schools of Buddhism. One of the other ancient ones was the Sautrantika school, and I can't remember what the third one was. But he said doctrinally, those were like three of the most conservative schools of Buddhism. So Theravada lucked out. You know, we had good karma, I guess, in that one of the most faithful representatives of what the Buddha taught, which still is not perfect, but still it was one of the best in ancient times, that it's the one that survived. So should a layperson who experienced Nirodha, should such a person be ordained or better stay as a layman? Well, I mean, if you're that advanced, I mean, you're either fully enlightened or this far away from being fully enlightened, then yeah, you might as well just become a monk. Why not? Go for it, I say. So I'll just move on to Nature Cure's next question here. If a layperson gets fully enlightened, he has to get ordained quickly by orthodox. What's the detailed explanation of this? And the detailed explanation, I mean, for me, I think to some degree it's like a religious propaganda. That it is a doctrine, not one of the essential central doctrines of Theravada Buddhism, but it is a doctrine that if you become fully enlightened, you have to be ordained as a monastic within about 24 hours or you're going to die. And it's a way of, I mean, it's a spin-off of the belief that really Theravadan or Buddhist monasticism has a monopoly on enlightenment. So, I mean, they have to admit, because there are stories in the text of people like Bahia who were not ordained Buddhist monks who did become enlightened, but then he died. He was like trampled by a cow just a matter of minutes after his enlightenment. So, I mean, there are cases in the text of a non-Buddhist becoming enlightened, but they generally don't live very long after that. And then that got turned into a doctrine that if you're enlightened, you better get ordained fast or you're going to die a violent, sudden death. And the detailed explanation, in my opinion, I mean, just being objective, is it's probably a kind of religious propaganda that, you know, Buddhist monks and nuns are superior to other people spiritually, and you know they can handle being enlightened. You know, they've got the karma, they got the good karma that will sustain being enlightened in this world as a human being. Whereas if you don't have the sangha supporting you, then for some reason it's just you're such an anomaly in the matrix, so to speak, that you're just going to get glitched out. So I assume that's why, but I am skeptical. I mean, assuming that enlightenment really means something genuinely in a samsaric context, I do not think that Buddhist monasticism has a monopoly on enlightenment. So I do think that that's this kind of a religious thing that, sort of supports the religion, and it may have been come up with in good faith by just people who really had a very high opinion of Theravada Buddhism and a very low opinion of anyone who wasn't a Theravada Buddhist or who wasn't a Buddhist at all. Sort of like the Christian idea that, I mean, not all Christians believe this, but a lot of Christians believe that if you don't belong to, whatever sect of Christianity they belong to, you're going to burn in hell. The Quran says this too. If you don't believe the Quran is true, you're going to burn in hell. Book of Mormon says this too. If you don't believe what the Book of Mormon says, you're going to burn in hell. And this is sort of a more refined version of that, where if you don't get ordained as a monk, in Theravada Buddhism, then you're going to die anyway, even if you're going to attain parinibbana when you die. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. As I said, we got lots of questions, and I've already been at it for an hour here. So this next question is from Cardinal Giovanni, a man who changes his name rather frequently. That he has gone by several other names, but now he's Cardinal Giovanni, and I congratulate him on his appointment, so to speak. So Cardinal Giovanni says, why do forest back to the primitive monks and so-called Christian desert fathers have essentially very similar lives? No or very little money, low on sleep, little to eat, and a lot of prayer or meditation. Well, I mean, it is possible that Buddhism had some effect on early Christianity, but I think the main reason why the Christian desert fathers were, like ascetic hermits living in poverty, and early Buddhist monks were ascetic hermits living in poverty, is just, I mean, it's, how do I explain this? It's, when you get to a certain level of wisdom, then it just makes sense to do certain things. I mean, if the world is so samsaric, living in town, participating in human traditions and so forth, cultural traditions, it kind of locks you into samsara to some degree. So if you want to get away from that, you go and become a hermit. I mean, that would explain the desert fathers going into the desert and the Buddhist monks going into the forest, is you're just getting away from all the craziness of human society. I mean, that just makes sense. It doesn't take an enlightened being to realize this. So then, with regard to the asceticism and poverty, I mean, that's pretty much universal among the higher spiritual traditions. The lower, like just religious traditions that don't really get very spiritual, it's not that big of a deal. But when you get up into the more refined spiritual traditions, and some Christianity fits that description, then you want to break your attachments to comfort and luxury and pleasure, just so that you can sort of clear your mind. Because if you're always craving comfort and pleasure and so forth, and having aversion for discomfort and pain and so forth, then your mind doesn't stay clear. You're losing your equanimity. You're just getting lost in samsara. So in order to rise above samsara, so to speak, you have to be indifferent. You have to be a stoic in a sense. You have to be okay with whatever happens. And the best way to practice that is through asceticism or austerity. And it doesn't take any kind of cultural transmission from one culture to another for that to spread. It's just that once you reach a certain level of wisdom and insight, you're going to see that for yourself. So, yeah, I think it's just a matter of people getting to a certain level of wisdom and realizing that you're better off just, renouncing society and going off and becoming a destitute ascetic if you want to realize the highest truth. You want to purify yourself. So, I guess I answered that. I'll move on to Cardinal Giovanni's next question, which is, so there is no complete translation of Sutta Pitaka into English. And almost all of the Sutta Pitaka has been translated into English. but I'm unaware of any translation of the Nidesa into English, largely because even if it was translated in English, almost nobody would want to read it anyway. Because it's really not that important of a book unless you just want to understand what the orthodox way of interpreting the Atthaka Wagga is, or you just want to see, how the early tradition dealt with a pre-Theravadan unorthodox text like the Atthaka Wagga, something like that. But generally, if you're that interested, you just probably can read Pali anyway. There might be a few other texts in the Sutta Pitaka, in the Khuddaka Nikaya, that are so obscure and just complicated and dry that nobody wants to read them. Something like the Neti Pakarana, which in Burma is considered to be canonical. I don't know if anyone translated that. Maybe the Nyanamoli, the first famous Nyanamoli, who translated the Visuddhimagga, maybe he translated that. I think he translated the Patisambhika also. So those kind of quasi Abhidhamma texts, like commentarial texts, that kind of thing. Maybe one or two of those also has not been translated into English, but most of them have. All the first four Nikayas have been translated. A lot of the Sutta Pitaka has been translated many times. The Dhammapada has been translated many, many times. So, but I don't know if one person has translated it all. I mean, it's just like one person has translated this, or another person has translated that, so that altogether, almost, it's like 98% at least of the Sutta Pitaka has been translated by someone or other. But I don't think there is just a uniform translation by one person, or like this group of translators all working together to translate everything. Like in Burma, it was like the Burmese government just hired a bunch of scholars to just make an official Burmese translation of the entire Tipitaka. So they've got that in Burma, probably places like Thailand or Sri Lanka also. But in English, you're just relying on college professors in various places, that sort of thing, or monks. Monks generally make better translators just because they understand the tradition better, because they're living it. Whereas a lot of the early, like, university professor translator types, and they were just guessing and using common sense, which doesn't work very well. Like, Oxbridge, upper crusty British common sense may not translate into a correct translation of Pali into English. But I'm digressing fairly radically at this point. But there's no complete translation of the Sutta Pitaka in English, unless there's some obscure translations that I've never heard of, like of the Nidesa. But almost all of it has been translated. So I'll just move on to Cardinal Giovanni's next question here. If we lose everything and die, and then after being reborn again, lose everything and die, and so on forever, what would be the best evidence that we are not actually in hell? Well, from the Buddhist point of view, I mean, it's all pretty much hell. Right now we're in one of the more comfortable levels of hell, or at least we're in sort of a mid-level of hell. But it's all dukkha, and unlike in Christianity, where Satan is the king of hell, Mara, who is like the Buddhist devil, he's the king of samsara. He's even king up in heaven realms. So it doesn't exactly work if you're using like the Christian dichotomy of heaven and hell. It doesn't really work so well in Buddhism, because samsara is it's all dukkha. So long as you're in samsara, you're in dukkha. I mean, if you're up in a higher heaven realm, it's a refined, subtle kind of dukkha. Whereas if you're down in niraya, you're in avicii niraya, the lowest pit of hell, then you're in some really obvious, graphic, brutal kind of dukkha or suffering. But it's just a matter of degree. There is no sharp demarcation between heaven and hell like in the Abrahamic religions. It's just a spectrum, just a gradient And it's all just a matter of degree. So in a sense, you could say that right now we are in hell. It's just like one of a kind of a relatively comfortable level of it. But we're in samsara. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Indian Guy. An Indian guy says, is there anything that you know of that says you have to be ordained by a tradition to become enlightened and do it in full confidence in the Buddhist Dhamma? Couldn't I technically just go be homeless and live the ascetic Buddhist lifestyle with understanding of Dhamma? Well, I mean, we already discussed the idea that is orthodox and Theravada, that you can become enlightened if you're not an ordained Buddhist, but you better ordain fast if you don't want to die a sudden death. But setting that aside, is there anything that I know of that says you have to be ordained by a tradition to become enlightened and do it in full confidence in the Buddhist? Well, I think most traditions would advise you strongly to follow their tradition in order to become enlightened. And they might say that following other traditions is not nearly so good. Otherwise, why have that tradition if there's other traditions that are even better or just as good? But yeah, I mean, I think it is possible. I mean, assuming that even becoming enlightened in a samsaric context means anything, that it isn't just indeterminate or paradoxical, then personally, I'm of the opinion that lay people can become enlightened. You don't have to be a Buddhist even to become enlightened. Like Ramana Maharshi may have been enlightened. Neem Karoli Baba may have been enlightened. They were both Hindus. St. John of the Cross may have been enlightened. He was a Roman Catholic. Meister Eckhart may have been enlightened. Some Sufis may have been enlightened. And some of them were not ordained monastics. I'm not sure if Neem Karoli Baba was an ordained monastic. I mean, he was a sadhu, but whether he was ordained into some tradition through some ordination ceremony, I don't know. So the main advantage of belonging to a tradition, like for example, when I was young, before I became a monk, I was playing with the idea of maybe just making a wool robe for myself, getting a wooden bowl and just hitting the road and just wandering like a non-denominational Western wandering ascetic. But I knew myself well enough to know that an established tradition would have these sets of rules and just like the way of doing things that would discipline me better. I would be better at being disciplined by an already established tradition and senior members of that tradition than just going it on my own. So being a member of some kind of sangha, and by sangha I don't mean just going to a dharma hall where people meditate once a week and call themselves sangha, possibly without even keeping any precepts. But just having like a well-established wisdom tradition supporting you, and maybe other people in that tradition, including elders who have been on the path longer than you have, helping you. I mean, that definitely has advantages to it. Having a kalyana mita, the good friend, the good spiritual friend, if not an outright guru, then that can be helpful, because just going on your own has certain drawbacks. Like if you're just going it on your own, trying to become enlightened through your own efforts, just nobody keeping you in line, no established tradition keeping you in line, then as a general rule, you're going to, work on the stuff you're already good at and ignore or avoid working on the stuff you're not so good at. It's like people that are sleepyheads, they might do tongas with regard to not eating very much, eating once a day, eating only alms food, but just sleeping in a sitting position, they're not going to do that just because they've got too much attachment to that. It's like, I mean, it does help to have a teacher who points out your weaknesses. Like Ajahn Chah, a good example. He'd get to know a student, and then whatever was their weaknesses, he'd make them face it. If they're afraid of ghosts, he'd make them stay in cemeteries, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it does help to have some kind of teacher who can look at you from like a heightened perspective and see what you need to work on and get you to do that, and maybe berate you or scold you if you don't do it. Because if you just rely on your own volition and your own best judgment and everything, you're going to have blind spots and so forth. And I mean, it's just a truism that other people can see a person's faults better than that person can see his own faults in a lot of cases. That people can just justify, like a cowardly person, generally, as a general rule, they justify their timidity. You know, they try and turn it into a virtue. And I mean, if you're doing that kind of stuff, then I mean, it's definitely a handicap. I mean, it's still possible to become enlightened. Maybe you'll just get beaten over the head, have a near-death experience, and that'll be enough to just jolt you out of like identifying with samsara. I mean, there are cases of that happening, allegedly anyway. So let's see. If you really want to become enlightened, then probably your best bet is to join some kind of enlightenment tradition, rather than just trying to do it on your own, because you are going to have blind spots and so forth. And the enlightenment tradition, in most cases, is going to have hundreds of years of dealing with people like you that, you know, they've got it all worked out on what should be done in this case or that case or whatever. Whereas you may have to reinvent the wheel over and over again if you're doing it on your own. Even just reading books, you got access to books, but still the book isn't going to scold you if you're not doing something right. So I'm just going to move on to the Indian guy's next question, which is, do you think or know if the Buddha taught that chanting is some kind of seemingly magical power that reaches beings? I'm not discounting it or anything because it seems wholesome and I think it's nice, but I don't know. I'm a skeptic by nature and or condition. I listen to chants and they go to a monastery where they do them, and they are nice to hear. Maybe there's more to it than I think. Well, just the act of chanting itself doesn't have any kind of paranormal effect. In fact, in Vinaya, the rules of monastic discipline, monks are forbidden from adopting like a sing-song chanty voice. They're supposed to just use like an ordinary speaking voice when they're reciting texts. There are paritas in Theravada Buddhism, which are like protection texts that have like some kind of power. You know, like the Metta Sutta is, you know, supposed to pacify like malevolent beings. The Kanda Sutta is supposed to protect you from snake bite. The Angulimala Sutta, as a parita, is supposed to help women in childbirth. There's the Fish King Jataka, that if you recite that, with the Macha Raja Sutta, I think it's called. It's not one of the standard list in Burma, but if you recite that, it helps against drought. You know, if there's a drought, sometimes in Burma, the monks will be reciting the Fish King Jataka in order to cause it to rain. But it's not really the chanting. It's like the meaning of the text and like the volition of the person who is perceiving the text. You know, if you're believing in it, you know, by the power of this truth, like a lot of these, like not jatakas, but paritas, they're based on like an asseveration of truth. Did I say asseveration? Is asseveration a word? Asseveration? I don't know. But it's like, by the power of this truth, may the forest fire be averted. Like there's the baby quail Jataka, you know, the Wutta Sutta, where the Buddha was a baby quail in a previous existence, supposedly. And there was a forest fire that was threatening his whole quail family. And so he made some assertion of truth. And I can't remember what the assertion of truth was in his case. But like Angulimala, his assertion of truth is, you know, since I became a monk, I have not harmed a living being. You know, he was a serial killer before he became a monk. But since he became a monk, he hasn't harmed a single being. By the power of this truth, may you be well, you know. And somehow that has power, but it's not just the words, but it's like the vow, it's like the strength of the strength of truth somehow has like a metaphysical power that can make things happen, or it's just your own mental powers that are boosted by this truth that can actually, serve as a kind of psychic power. Or like in the case of the Metta Sutta, then, it's just love. You're generating love towards some being or other, or towards all beings, and that has some kind of effect. So, yeah, chanting in and of itself, it doesn't have any magical power or paranormal power or psychic power. Chanting in and of itself, it's the mental states of the people who are reciting the text. The text has wisdom, and that wisdom is sort of realized in the mind of the person who is chanting it and believing it. And so it's more a matter of mental states of the people who are chanting it and the people who are hearing it, rather than any kind of psychic power contained in the chant itself. It's sort of like tarot cards. It's like there are factories that manufacture tarot cards, but they don't have a machine that implants prognosticative powers into these cards. I mean, it's just cardboard laminated with plastic, and it's got ink, and that's it. But it's like, if tarot cards have any power at all, it's the power of the people that are using the cards. It's just kind of a gimmick for releasing their own psychic talents. In some cases, maybe it works. And so chanting is sort of like that. I mean, the chanting in and of itself is just sound. Words on paper that are then recited, but any power to it is going to be coming from the mental states of the chanter and the hearer, especially if they believe it. They believe that it's going to have power. It can cause a sort of placebo effect, or the power of faith. So in the text, the Buddha did recommend certain chants, or just reciting certain discourses, like the Metta Sutta or the Khandha Sutta, for certain things. But it wasn't that chanting in general has power. It's just that, the ideas in the mind, as you're reflecting or contemplating these texts, that has power. So it's mental states. And so I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is from Austin. And Austin asks a metaphysical question. How do we make general knowledge claims about the world if the world itself is illusionary? And illusionary, is that a word too? Asseveration and illusionary. I don't know if they're in the dictionary. And would this follow? Well, I'll just better start over. I rudely interrupted Austin when he was asking this question. Austin says, how do we make general knowledge claims about the world if the world itself is illusionary? And would this follow that knowledge is impossible because coming to know everything is an illusion is also part of the illusion? Well, in Buddhism, you've got two levels of truth. You've got conventional truth, or samuti sacha, and you've got ultimate truth, or paramatta sacha. And general knowledge claims about the world are conventional truth. They aren't really true. They're true just because people agree that they are true. But they're not ultimately true. They do not apply to ultimate reality. So, yeah, general knowledge claims about the world are like quasi-true. They're true within the context of being a human being. But the ultimate truth is essentially nibbana, at least in my opinion. So knowledge is impossible. No, because true knowledge, genuine knowledge, has to transcend samsara. It has to transcend the system that generates statements, symbols. You have to go beyond the symbols of words and perceptions in order to get to ultimate truth. So ultimate, like, true knowledge is possible, but you're not going to get there through thinking, through perception. It's not going to happen. I mean, unless you're using perception as a way of destroying perception. There's like some Mahayana texts. The purpose of Lord Buddha's teaching is to free us from our thinking by means of our thinking. Or also, like, there's the statement about the Zen master who uses words, like a master archer uses arrows, where that master archer can shoot down an arrow in flight with his own arrow. You know, that somebody shoots an arrow, he can shoot that arrow down with his own arrow. And the Zen master uses words in the same way. He'll use words to like shoot down your own ideas, just to so that they all fall to the ground and there's just like emptiness and silence behind. And from the emptiness and silence, because you're not being distracted by all these symbolic perceptions, genuine wisdom can arise, an insight into true knowledge. So I don't think that true knowledge is impossible. But all this samsaric knowledge isn't true knowledge. Like science isn't true knowledge. It's knowledge, it's conventional knowledge. It's symbolic, semi-knowledge. Virtual knowledge. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Indiana Dama. And Indiana Dama says, your answer on Eckhart Tolle in the previous Q&A has caused a question to form in my mind. Do you think the Buddha was fully enlightened during his earthly life? While I do believe he was fully enlightened, I've long wondered just what that would mean. There is likely no answer to that since we're all trapped in samsara. Well, I mean, I've been talking about this a few times already in this Q&A, and in several other Q&As. It's like enlightenment itself is problematic, especially from a samsaric context, because enlightenment transcends samsara. Samsara has no access to it. It's sort of like in sometimes you'll see in the text that the gods, the devas, who can read people's minds, they still don't know what's going on in the Buddha's mind when he's meditating. It's just beyond their reach. They just can't get it. So again, it's like from a samsaric point of view, he probably had certain quirks that like a skeptic would say, aha, there, you see, he did this, so that means he's not enlightened. But I do think that what's going on at the samsaric level is largely irrelevant to his enlightenment. I mean, he may have become a saint in order to become enlightened. And then after becoming enlightened, he remained relatively, or if not completely saintly. But some people may be able to attain enlightenment before even reaching the level of, perfect sainthood. So, do I think the Buddha was fully enlightened during his earthly life? There's no way of proving it one way or the other. I accept it as a working hypothesis, but it's problematic to the extent that his enlightenment is going to be transcending samsara. So, I mean, it's not going to be really at this worldly level. At this worldly level, I'm sure there's going to be skeptics, and there always have been skeptics, even in the Buddha's own time, who would just criticize him and just not even just making shit up against him. It's like, well, look what he's doing. Like some of the hardcore ascetics, like the Jains and the Ajivakas in the Buddha's time, would just accuse him of being just some soft, shaven-headed householder who's still wallowing in sensuality. Or the Hindus might, or the Brahmins, the Vedic Brahmins, might accuse him of just being like a nihilist who is, endorses the extinction of the human race because he endorses celibacy. And obviously the non-Buddhists are going to come up with justifications for criticizing the Buddha or seeing him as, inadequate, if not a charlatan, at least he's just kind of deluding himself into thinking he's enlightened. So it depends on your point of view, really. I mean, if you're a foolish person who's looking at the world through foolishness-colored glasses is going to see everything as foolish. And that's kind of the way samsara works. So, yeah, if anyone can be fully enlightened, I think there's a really good chance that Gautama Buddha of the Shakya clan was fully enlightened. And that is a working hypothesis of mine, but I have no way of proving it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Mirror of Emptiness. And the mirror says, what is the difference between walking meditation and pacing back and forth brooding? Well, I think there may be a certain amount of overlap. For example, if you're pacing back and forth brooding about Dhamma, brooding about death, brooding about, some sort of object of meditation, then that could be qualified as a kind of walking meditation. But as a general rule, walking meditation is you are being mindful of the present moment. Like whatever feelings or sensations are paramount, whatever are the ones that are the most obvious, the most conspicuous, like the movements of your legs, the pressure of the ground against your feet, the oily sensation in your knees as they kind of swing back and forth. Or, you could just be doing a mantra while you're doing meditation, like Om or Buddho, something like that. That would be like legitimate walking meditation. You could even be counting your steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 10. And then you go back to 1 through 5, like that. That's like a very elementary method of doing walking meditation for beginners, just to kind of train your mind to focus on the process of walking. But if your mind's just going all over the place, then yeah, that's not walking meditation. But if you are brooding on like the inevitability of death or something, that might qualify as walking meditation as you pace back and forth with a furrowed brow. So I think I answered that one. So I'm going to move on to the next question here, which is from Rybalder. And Rybalder says, was urine drinking or bathing a part of monastic life? And I don't think it's ever been central to monastic life, drinking pee or like bathing in pee. But it is true that every single monk who is ordained at his ordination ceremony, he is admonished with regard to using the 4 requisites. And the 4 requisites are food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. Those are the 4 requisites for a monk. And with regard to each of these, one is given an admonishment. And with regard to medicine, I might as well do all 4. It's like with regard to food, a monk is admonished. Like the new monk who's just getting ordained, at his ordination, he is admonished that he should content himself with eating only alms food. You take your bowl and walk through the village. People put whatever food they want to put into your bowl. When you get enough, you leave and you eat it. That's it. You should content yourself with that. But it's not against the rules to accept an invitation to somebody's house, and then they'll feed you there. With regard to clothing, every monk should content himself with rag robes. He should just content himself with picking up rags off the ground and sewing them together into robes. But it's not against the rules to accept a robe from somebody who donates to you a robe or robe cloth that isn't rags. And I've got a dog loudly snoring behind me. What are you doing back there? With regard to, shelter, every monk at his ordination is admonished that you should content yourself with living at the root of a tree. You should just don't even go under a roof. Don't stay in a building. Just live at the root of a tree. But it's not against the rules to live in a building. And then with regard to medicine, every monk is admonished at his ordination that he should content himself with puti mota as his medicine. Puti mota is like putrefied urine. And I guess that was a thing, some sort of like traditional medicine in ancient northern India, at least among ascetics, that putrefied urine, and urine putrefies pretty fast. You just put it in, pee into a milk jug and then just leave it there for a day. And you come back a day later, it smells just overwhelmingly strong. And that is supposed to be used as medicine, but it is allowable to use other kinds of medicine too. It's just sort of an ideal. And there are a few monks that still drink urine, and they probably have always been at least a few, probably in ancient times a little more back before they invented like, state of the art malaria medication and so forth. With regard to bathing in pee, I only knew that one monk, an Indonesian monk, who would wash his head in his own putrefied urine every day until I finally made him just stop keeping the jug of pee in the outhouse because it was just causing the entire outhouse to just reek. It was just this overwhelming stench. So, yeah, I mean, drinking urine as a medicine is just right at the heart of being a monk. It's right there in the ordination ceremony that you are admonished. You should content yourself with putrefied urine as medicine. But I think it's a rather small minority that really do that. I'm sure there are some. I've, like in the previous Q&A, I mentioned experimenting with it a little bit, but it wasn't for me. And they've got better medicine than putrefied urine. Believe it or not, there are now better medications on the market than putrefied pee. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Oyalt. And Oyalt says, today's selection of questions are, oh, I guess I could have edited that part out. Forget that part. Just don't even remember that I said that. Oops. I almost erased his name at the same time. See. All right. Oyalt's first question is, do you have any guns? If yes, what kinds? And I personally own a Glock 19, a 9mm. Although I found out after I got that there's a larger caliber Glock that's about the same size that I probably would have got instead. But it's just there in case of an emergency. And I don't even go to the firing range. I mean, I haven't shot the thing in over a year. It used to be when we lived at the other house that we had some forest behind our house. You could go out in the forest and shoot at targets and so forth. But here we're living in a subdivision with a tiny backyard, and it just doesn't work out that way. So I'd have to drive somewhere in order to practice shooting. So yeah, I've got the Glock 19. My sweetheart has a little Smith & Wesson that's just like for protection. And also for her birthday a couple years ago, I got her a Ruger 22 rifle, which she has fired a total of once since she got it. So those are the guns that we have. It's just 2 pistols and a 22 rifle. I mean, maybe someday, if I'm feeling like I've got too much money, I'll get like a Mossberg pump shotgun or something. But at present, I think our armory is stocked enough for our needs, which is just in case of an emergency. If the zombie apocalypse finally hits, that kind of thing. Well, no, I won't get into zombies. This is going to be long enough as it is. So you are spared a discourse on zombies. So I'll just move on to Oyalt's next question here, which is, do you consider any shots safe? And then in parentheses, he says, trying to avoid the forbidden words. And then he says, for example, polio or hepatitis, etc. Well, I took the polio. And if I remember correctly, it was just like on a sugar cube. You ate it. It wasn't an injection. I've had hepatitis when I was in Burma. One doctor said it was amoebic hepatitis, where dysentery amoebas had invaded my liver. But I don't recall any kind of shots. Maybe I was on an IV. It's all kind of vague. I was pretty out of it at the time. But I have had. I still got the little scar. I'm old enough to still have the little scar on my shoulder there. I've had a few in my life. I think the most recent time I was like 14 years old and was bitten by a dog when I was riding my bike. So I got a tetanus shot for that. Once when I was in Burma, I stepped on it was an acacia spine or a cactus spine, which went way up into my heel and broke off. And I was limping around for days. And some supporter tried to force me to get a tetanus shot. And just because they were trying to force me to do it, I refused to get the tetanus shot. So a doctor came with, or not, because of course this is going on YouTube. So maybe I just take that back. It's all good. So some people, they ask me questions that compromise me because I have to give like what I consider to be an honest answer, and then I might get into trouble for it. So anyway, Oil, this naughty fellow, asks a third question, which is, also, is there some sort of way or initiation into the Discord server? Well, you have to find my YouTube, or not my YouTube, forget that. You're going to have to find my email address, which is possible. It's out there. And then send it. But if you continue asking these compromising questions, then you may be seen as a glowy or worse. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. Man. Gosh, maybe I should just delete that question, just edit it out. Because I got slammed for, I mean, this isn't as bad as the last time yet. But still. Yeah, maybe I'll just have to go back and do a little editing on this. So anyways, the next question is from the proto-pseudo-monk, alias Cool Whip. And Cool Whip says, or the proto-pseudo-monk, as you prefer. Oh yeah, I need to specify here that he generally puts titles at the beginning of his questions. So the first title is Sufficient Condition for Enlightenment, and then in parentheses, Attitude towards Death. And let's see, the question is, do all unenlightened beings have either desire or aversion towards death? Or in other words, can the non-fear of death exclusively be a sufficient condition to indicate one is fully enlightened? No, I don't think that a non-fear of death exclusively is going to be a sufficient condition to indicate one is fully enlightened. I mean, we're living in a wimpy age now where to be freaked out about death is commonplace, but it hasn't always been that way. And it wasn't so long ago that there were a lot of people who thought death before dishonor was just common sense. That just facing death with equanimity was just the way it was supposed to be done. And I assume some people succeeded in that. So to be indifferent towards death, I do not think is a sufficient condition to indicate one is fully enlightened. There are three kinds of craving, according to the Orthodox tradition: craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, and craving for non-existence. So even if you don't have any craving for existence, or for that matter, craving for non-existence, you can still have craving for sensual pleasures, which will keep you in samsara. So it may be that these heroes of the past who died with equanimity, they died gloriously on the battlefield or whatever, without a flinch of terror or any such thing. They still probably had a craving for being with their sweetheart after the battle was over, if they survived it, that kind of thing. They probably still had the craving for glory. So, or basking in glory, the pleasure of, defeating their enemies and seeing them driven before them and hearing the lamentation of the women. So I'm just going to move on to the next question from Cool Whip, or the proto-pseudo-monk. And the title of this question is Overcoming ADHD with Stimulants and Breaking the Precepts. And then the question is, for a person diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD, mitigating the symptoms using stimulants such as medication, such as methylphenidate, and music, isochronic tones, are these breaches of the fifth and seventh precept in the context of right livelihood? The justification: if one cannot focus when one needs to focus, one cannot have a livelihood. Consequently, one has more time to study and practice the Dhamma, it's not a question of craving stimulants, but rather using stimulants to merely function, to have food and shelter. Well, first of all, let's see, there's two things here. Using stimulants as medication, which is here is methylphenidate. I guess I should read what he says a little lower down here. He's got an appendix. He says, under normal circumstances, the prefrontal cortex regulates attention, behavior, and emotion. Deficits in prefrontal cortex functioning have been linked to ADHD. Symptoms such as poor impulse control, weak sustained attention, and heightened distractibility. Impaired prefrontal abilities are characterized by too little dopamine and norepinephrine. And then he says methylphenidate inhibits the reuptake of dopamine and norepinephrine, increased dopaminergic and noradrenergic activity in the prefrontal cortex, thereby improving focus and lessening distractions, etc. Okay, so getting back up here, if you're taking medication, I mean, first of all, let's just set aside that apparently Cool Whip here is taking like scientific realism as fact. That he is assuming that all the stuff he was talking about with all the syllables was reality. And I doubt that. But still, this getting to the gist of the question here is taking the medication for ADHD against the precept against intoxicants, and that depends on whether it's an intoxicant or not. I mean, are you getting intoxicated so that you're going into a stupor? I don't think so. I mean, all stimulants are not necessarily, they don't necessarily cause cloudedness of mind. Caffeine, for example, does not necessarily cause cloudedness of mind. In fact, one could argue that it causes a little bit of the opposite, at least in most people, which is one of the reasons why people drink coffee, especially in the morning. Helps to wake them up. So, yeah, I mean, if it puts you into a stupor, then you might be better off with the ADHD, at least from a spiritual point of view. But from what he says about it, I don't think that it really is an intoxicant that causes cloudedness of mind. So I don't think that there's an issue there. With regard to listening to music and its isochronic tones, I mean, again, the purpose of listening to music is for entertainment. You know, if you're getting pleasure from listening to the music and you're also keeping 8 precepts, then it would be in violation of one of the 8 precepts, which would be playing musical instruments, listening or watching entertainment shows, that kind of a thing, singing, dancing. So it would depend on your purpose of doing it. I mean, if you're doing it as a kind of medication, and isochronic tones does not sound all that musical to me. I mean, it does not sound like, hey man, let's go listen to some isochronic tones. I don't know. It just doesn't sound very pleasant. I mean, it might be, but I think in some cases, you just have to weigh the pros and cons and choose the lesser of two evils, assuming the isochronic tones are an evil or the ADHD is an evil. But it's a matter of karma, and he's going to ask a question about karma coming right up next here. So let's just move on to that one. Let's see. Yeah, I think I answered that question. So let's just go to his third question, the title of which is modifying or disrupting karma through body instead of through mind. And then he says, is this cheating? Is this cheating in quotes? From the Buddhist perspective, or more generally, is manipulating brain function by way of pharmacology or other means, e.g. Neuralink biotechnology, short-circuiting karma instead of working out your karma through mind experientially. It's like overriding your karma because your karma determines the genes and brain of your next life. So are you artificially altering the body from your previous karma without doing any actual work to work it out? And again, he just seems to be assuming that the physical body is ultimately real. I think we may have a scientific realist in our midst. But, I mean, everything that occurs to you is conditioned by karma. So, I mean, you wouldn't even hear about the pharmacology or Neuralink or biotechnology or anything without having the karma that allows you to do it, because in a sense you're dreaming your way through this existence. And so you're dreaming the Neuralink, you're dreaming the biotechnology in a sense until you're fully awake. So, I mean, that's just all part of your karma. So it's not short-circuiting karma. There's one thing that did occur to me, like, let's say you're 200 years from now, technology has continued to advance because civilization somehow has managed not to collapse. That you get some sort of brain implant that just increases your IQ by 1,000% or some such. Then, I mean, it might be that there's such a radical change in your mind that it's just not you anymore, that in a sense you died and got replaced by some other being with an IQ of 1,000% higher than yours. I think that's possible. I mean, you could make changes to your mind that are just so radical that it's just not you anymore. I mean, it might just be like a moment of death and then just somebody else starts up. So I've considered the possibility of that. I think it's not Orthodox Theravada. I think that would be heresy from the Orthodox Theravada point of view. But Orthodox Theravada really didn't have a concept of Neuralink or biotechnology or, let's see here, methylphenidate. So, yeah, I don't think there's any way of cheating karma. That if it's not your karma to take the drug or to get the implant or the operation or whatever, then you're just not going to have it. But that's one reason why I consider it to be unlikely that anyone will ever invent an enlightenment pill. You just take this pill, you become enlightened. Let's assume that it's red. And yeah, I just don't think that people are going to have the karma for that to happen. That all of a sudden they're just going to be poofed into enlightenment from taking this pill. Probably wouldn't be good for the pharmaceutical industry or something like that. So even if somebody invented it, it'd probably get squelched. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Rui. And we've been going almost 2 hours. I told you this is going to be a long one. And if you guys didn't go potty, you got nobody but yourselves to blame. So this is from Rui. Do you think the sequence Sila Samadhi Panya can be reversed, or is it linear and inviolable? Well, I've mentioned before, this was quite some time ago, that to some degree they're simultaneous. I mean, you have to have some kind of panya already to even want to keep Sila. So it's like the legs of a tripod. Sila could be considered more basic, and then Samadhi and Panya, sort of, ascending order of like subtlety or profundity or something. But still, I mean, they're all developing simultaneously. That making a linear sequence out of it is, I don't think that's entirely correct. It may be just a way of getting your head around something, a way of helping you to understand it in a useful way, even though it might not be technically 100% factual or legitimate. But still, sometimes thinking in terms of like slightly dumbed down analogies or models can be useful. And it does make a certain logical sense that you start with what is most fundamental and then you work your way to, liberating insight, panya. But still, to some degree, they're all simultaneous and they're all sort of interacting with each other. It's a three-body problem that cannot be figured out mathematically. So I'll just move on to the next question here, also by Rui, which is, where would you place intellectual contemplation on the path? Well, I mean, it's certainly not at the end of the path. So intellectual contemplation would start off towards the beginning of the path. And then, I mean, it could get up, I mean, the more subtle the contemplation is, the more advanced it is, until finally, I mean, it may be that the highest intellectual contemplation on the path would be, I mean, something along the lines of Zen koans, where, I mean, you're using the mind to destroy itself, sort of like that saying from the Mahayana Sutra that quoted earlier, you know, the purpose of Lord Buddha's teaching is to liberate us from our thinking by means of our thinking. So if you can start using the intellect, sort of like Majjhimaka, like the philosophy of Nagarjuna, where you're using the intellect to just sort of hit its own limits and just turn upon itself, just destroy the validity of all intellectual arguments, and then finally consume itself, then I mean it could be up towards the end. I mean you could be placing intellectual contemplation, you know, I mean you could be using that as a legitimate path up until shortly before you reach the end of the path, assuming that the path even has an end. So I guess like in yoga, there's what jnana yoga, which is, you know, the yoga of knowledge, which would involve some intellectual contemplation, I assume. But you know, it depends on what kind of intellectual contemplation it is. Just like studying like Buddhist doctrines in a book, I mean, that would be relatively elementary. Um, you know, just dealing with subtle metaphysics would be a little less elementary, but still, I mean, the the goal is not intellectual. So you're going to have to eventually leave intellect behind. But I think different people will leave it behind at different places. And I failed to close the blinds before doing this video. So if I lean back, I'm starting to get like white marks on my face, like right now. So maybe I'll have to get up in a few minutes and fix the blinds, but I'll just move on to Rui's next and third question here, which is, how did you feel in your first days and weeks as a fully ordained mendicant? Um, well, I mean, it was starting off on something new, so there was like this wide-eyed idealism and just sort of like being blown away by the whole situation. I think that would be a good way of explaining it. It's a kind of prose poem that I don't know if I still have it online anywhere. It's I think it was written by a Burmese man named U Win Pei. Um, he put in poetic form a really good description of just like the faith and idealism, you know, the beginner's mind of someone who's just setting out on the path. That is really nice. Maybe I'll try and find that. But yeah, it was just sort of a wide-eyed idealism and also a certain amount of stress and strain. Like right around the time of my ordination, I was getting all kinds of ailments, all kinds of stuff coming up. I get like a letter from the IRS saying that they think that I underreported my taxes or something. Just all this stuff is coming up. And in a way, it's like what Mary Baker Eddy talks about as chemicalization. Like in Christian Science, when you're using whatever it is that Christian scientists use, I don't know if they would say that it's faith healing as a way of healing somebody, the person will often get markedly worse right before they get better. And it's a way of sort of the system purifying itself of all this shit before it can return to wellness. And that's kind of the way it was with me. It was like all this shit was happening as a way of just getting it out of the way so I could be pure enough to move on to the next stage, so to speak. And yeah, if I lean back, I got these lights in my face. So let's see here. Yeah, it's kind of hard to explain exactly how I felt because it was a long time ago. It was well over 30 years ago. But yeah, I think just like wide-eyed idealism and just being blown away by the whole thing, and just, you know, the realization that I was setting upon this momentous change in my life. And then like after a few months, I started becoming like disillusioned and sullen because I realized that it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be, because most monks really do not have a spiritual vocation. You know, they're not striving for enlightenment. Most monks in an Asian culture especially, you know, they've got their own reasons, and most of them really are not striving for enlightenment, which was kind of a buzzkill for me. You know, it was very disillusioning when I realized that, you know, most monks, you know, like the overwhelming majority, especially of Asian monks from a Buddhist culture, you know, they're really not striving for enlightenment. At best, they're striving for a better rebirth, just like the lay people are striving. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Lieberlam. And Lieberlam says, what do you think are the best teas to drink in Burma as a monk and the United States as a layperson? Well, I mean, the best teas to drink in Burma as a monk, Lieberlam probably doesn't realize this, but strict monks in Burma won't drink tea because there is an obscure rule in the chapter on medicines in the Vinaya. I think it's the Vinaya Mahavaga, the Besaja Khandaka, that it says that the juice of all greens is allowable in the afternoon except for the juice of pot herbs, which is like greens that have been cooked, like spinach or something, and then you drain the water off. You're not allowed to drink that in the afternoon because it's considered to be some kind of soup or vegetable or something. And in Burma, tea leaves are eaten as a vegetable. It's tea leaf salad is really good. I don't know why they don't sell it in the West. I've never seen tea leaf salad in the West. It's called lepet in Burma. And so tea leaves are considered to be a kind of greens. It's like a salad green. And so the tea that you drink is like the water that's drained off from cooking the tea leaves. And so strict monks will not drink tea in the afternoon, maybe in the morning. But I mean, they don't have brands, or if there are brands, I don't remember a single brand of tea from Burma. You know, it's just stuff. It's just this green, crude, dried leaves that you just make tea out of. I mean, it's not, the Burmese are not nearly as brand conscious as we Western consumers are. You know, you just wind up with a jar with these tea leaves in it and you just drink it, and they don't really care about the quality. Maybe rich people that I didn't associate with much would, you know, get some special kind of tea, but the villagers that I mostly was associating with, you know, they just get some at the shop that probably doesn't have a brand or anything. It's just they buy it bulk in a jar or something, or get it bulk out of a jar. You know, it's just this jar at the store. You take as much as you need or whatever. So the best teas to drink in Burma, I have no idea. Maybe, I mean, if you go to Burma and want to drink some kind of special tea, then yeah, just get something grown in Burma, which most of it is. Like Shan State in Burma is, they have got a lot of tea plantations. Most of it comes from there, I assume. But with regard to the best tea to drink in the United States as a layperson, I'd say Milo's. You can get it by the gallon, and on a hot day, it goes down really good. Which I'm sorry to disappoint Lieberlam. He may have thought that I was some sort of epicure with regard to quality teas and would advise some kind of Darjeeling or something, but I'm going with Milo's because that's really my favorite tea to drink. Publix also makes a kind of green tea with honey and ginseng in it that they also sell by the gallon, which is the next best thing to Milo's. So I would advise those. And before I move on to the next question from Gaz, I've got to fix the blinds because I'm really starting to get stripes on me. So excuse me for one moment. Let's see here. One blind. And another blind. Okay, we should be completely blind now. Okay. Yeah, look it. I lean back, no stripes. That's good. So, the next question is from Gaz. And Gaz says, is it safe to say that the Buddha is the most venerated human being who is recognized as a human being that ever lived? Buddhism is the only serious religion that venerates a man and places him above the gods. Compared to the rather debasing and slavish attitude of other religions, it stands out amongst them. It is extremely glorifying and encouraging to humanity that a mere mortal man conquered all things and attained the absolute. I think Nietzsche overlooked this aspect of Buddhism and its potential to inspire mankind. You touched on this in your video, Cringe Buddhism, describing it as a bit of a reach, but can you not see an Ubermensch-like character within the Buddha? Well, of course, the Buddha he had attained superhuman mental states, the highest superhuman mental states, according to tradition. And it is true that Theravada considers him to be a human being, but it's just human nature that you want to glorify the founder of your spiritual tradition. So, I mean, it is the official position that the Buddha was a human being. He was a mortal human, but according to tradition, he was like 27 feet tall and had all these weird physical marks that set him apart from ordinary humans, which probably was not really the case. And it's much more inspiring and glorifying to have the Buddha saying, look, I'm a human like you. I did it. You can do it too. And this is how I would advise you to try to do it. I mean, for me, that's more inspiring than having him, 27 feet tall with 40 teeth, and his feet are shaped like an inverted capital T with his heels sticking out in back as far as the fronts of his feet stuck out in front, and all these weird marks. It made him look like a monster. I mean, he would hardly be considered a human if you saw him the way tradition represents him. So, and then the Mahayana Buddhists essentially just turned him into a god. He's like some cosmic deity. So, but I mean, there is some truth in what Gaz is saying. I mean, the Buddha is the most venerated human being who is recognized as a human being that ever lived, because he's got the highest gods in the Vedic pantheon coming down and groveling at his feet. That he is higher than the gods, because he is fully enlightened and the gods are not. So yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah, but then the tradition has pretty much kind of ruined it a bit by making him so far above the ordinary human. It's like he had to try for countless eons to perfect his paramis so that he could become the Buddha in the first place. And then he's born with all these anomalies, just inhuman anomalies. So that they took the original human Buddha and turned him into something that wasn't quite human anymore, or technically was human, but still was obviously just way different from the average human, just physically even. And of course, Christianity did the same thing with their founder. They turned him into God. So yeah, I guess there's another question here. So, can you not see an Ubermensch-like character within the Buddha? Sure. I mean, there's the term Uttari Manusa Dhamma, which is superhuman mental state that the Buddha attained big time. And I mean, even anyone who attains jhana or gets psychic powers, for example, has attained Uttari Manusa Dhamma, or superhuman mental states. So that would be like Ubermensch, superhuman. But definitely Nietzsche was not a Buddhist. Yeah. But like Julius Evola, he definitely went with the Buddhist Arya as Ubermensch idea. But I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid says, do you believe that theism is completely out of the picture or off the table? As I get older and the more I study, the more fear I have about being able to do this on my own. In that, as some theists say, relying on one's own understanding is immensely dangerous, and that we can't be saved by our works. There is some truth in this that more or less nullify the open-ended interpretative liberties of the speculative philosophical religions. However, two strong contentions arise, which is that we cannot actually qualify something like God or gods, and that we cannot know that a belief in one or many is a satisfying criteria for salvation, there is a persistent feeling I have that knowledge is not a criteria for enlightenment or the end of suffering, and I can't exactly explain why, other than that enlightened beings may be a metaphysically meaningless phrase, and that alleged enlightenments are told and alluded to. Never before have we ever empirically witnessed anyone become enlightened and not be born again. Any thoughts or comments? If my comment is too long, I prefer just a reply here. Not trying to be rude, as it seems you're disinterested in walls of texts. Yeah, well, very long questions, like an essay with thoughts, question mark at the end. It does take a lot of time, and it makes it just harder to answer the question, because I've got to like kind of dig through the question in order to tease out the gist of the question. And there might be like 2 or 3 questions that are embedded in the essay that I then have to isolate and so forth. But I mean, the very first sentence here, do you believe that theism is completely out of the picture or off the table? Well, he talks about like essentially grace, divine grace, that in Christianity you can't be saved through your own efforts. It takes divine grace. And there is some of that in Buddhism. That, I mean, there is sort of a Buddhist equivalent of divine grace, because you can't make yourself be enlightened, because making is karma. Karma literally means making or doing. So nothing that you do is going to get you enlightened. You can't make yourself be enlightened. Nobody can make yourself be enlightened, including the gods. So, I mean, there is a kind of divine grace involved that you don't have any control over. Like Krishnamurti said, I mean, you can open the window, but you can't make the wind blow in. The best you can do is get everything ready and open the window, and maybe the wind will blow in. You know, like the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha is saying that, you know, if you practice perfect mindfulness, you know, you practice really good mindfulness for a week straight, then he doesn't guarantee you're going to become enlightened. He'll say one of 2 things is going to happen. Either you're going to become enlightened, or you're going to get really close to becoming enlightened. So, yeah, there is a kind of divine grace aspect to Buddhism also, even though it's not really specified as what exactly it is, other than, I mean, reality is always here. If you define enlightenment as a realization of ultimate reality, then, I mean, the ultimate reality is here all the time. It's always here. And all it's going to take is just one little jolt that's beyond your control, or just, it's like, in a way, you just stop, or you just give up in a way, that then all of a sudden that this liberating insight can arise, but you can't force it to arise. It happens when it happens. And for some people, it may happen earlier than for others, and other people, it may take a long time. They may have to get all the way to, they have to master 4th jhana before it can happen. Other people, they might just get hit over the head with a big board, you know, that falls off a truck or something, have a near-death experience, and that might be enough. Or they might just get temporary or momentary samadhi, kanika samadhi, according to like the Mahasi tradition. We'll say kanika samadhi is good enough. You don't even have to get jhana. You don't even have to get neighborhood concentration. Just momentary, moment-to-moment concentration, just mindfulness of the present moment is good enough. So, I mean, some people have to get farther than others, which indicates that it's not you follow this path until you get to the end of the path and there's like the pearly gates of Nibbana there. It doesn't work that way. The path has no end. And it's just you keep following the path until something that is beyond your control, because control will be karmic. And anything that's karmic is going to be temporary and ultimately unsatisfying. So, yeah, but I mean, theism isn't going to help you any, because, I mean, how's God going to do it? If it's just impossible to be done, that you're liberated through action, you know, I mean, you can't be liberated through your own actions. You can't be liberated through someone else's actions. So, there is that. But I do think that there is some kind of validity to the idea of divine grace, even though the divine grace may not be coming from Jehovah God Almighty. Because Jehovah God Almighty, if you read the Old Testament, he doesn't strike me as being particularly wise anyway. In fact, he seems to be fairly samsaric, and he himself does not appear to be enlightened. So, gosh, if there's any other questions, I don't think there are any other questions. There's only one question mark in the whole thing, and that's in the very top of the question. So I guess I answered that question. I kind of. Some of these questions are really hard to answer when you're trying to discuss ultimate reality. And I mean, you have to do it within the context of conventional reality, because that's the context of any kind of sentence or idea. That, I mean, it's to some degree, it's an exercise in futility. Futility of futilities, all is futile. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. I'm not sure if I really did an adequate job of answering that, but it's a difficult question to answer. So I'm just going to move on to Cleefy. And Cleefy says, what advice would you give me to restart my meditation practice? Can I do a simple observe the breath meditation on my own, or should I attend a Buddhist center and practice there? Well, you can just do anapanasati and get your meditation going on your own, or you could do a mantra or some other relatively simple meditation technique that starts out elementary, and then as you get better at it, becomes more and more advanced. I mean, it's not absolutely necessary to attend a Buddhist center and practice there. In fact, some Buddhist centers may not give very good meditation advice. You know, a lot of monks, you know, they're like Burmese monks. You know, they're good scholars. They might not meditate much, so they'll give you advice out of the book, and it's not even based on their own experience in a lot of cases. Or you might be going to some lay Buddhist center where you've got this rank amateurs who are set themselves up as the teachers. I mean, they may be wiser than the average person, but still, from the Buddhist point of view, they're still essentially beginners. And so they might not be able to give you much better advice than you could give yourself in some cases. But if you have access to like a reputable meditation teacher, or better yet, a meditation master, then it certainly wouldn't hurt for you to go and just receive some meditation instruction from him. But if you don't have access to that, then certainly you could just do anapana or a simple mantra or something, and just do it on your own. So I think I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin. And we have like more than 40 questions, not 40 more, but altogether, we're above 40 questions today. So I knew it was going to be a long one, especially because it is my nature to give very long answers to short questions with lots of digressions and so forth. So anyways, Skoladin says, would you kindly explain what happens when a person is stuck in a deep meditation they're just not ready for? For some reason, I thought it sounded like when computer nerds try to measure who has the world's fastest computer by forcing it to calculate pi until it melts down. And pi, of course, is the ratio between the diameter and circumference of a circle. Or maybe it's the circumference would be on the top of the fraction, and the diameter would be the bottom. So anyways, could I kindly explain what happens when a person is stuck in a deep meditation that they're just not ready for? I don't think you'd really get stuck in it. I think you'd eventually just get thrown off of it, that you're just not skillful enough to remain on the Bronco, or to skillfully drive the motorcycle or whatever, and eventually you're going to just crash. So if you get in a deep meditation for whatever reason, like you're in the presence of some really advanced guru whose aura, you know, it's just contagious mental states, you're picking up on his wisdom, and so you're just going into these spontaneous meditative states that you're just not ready for yet. You just start, like, in a lot of cases, you'll just start like violently shaking with like excess piti, it's called in Pali. I almost said in Burmese. But some people can mess themselves up. I mean, you can get health problems, you can get mental problems, especially some kinds of meditation are relatively dangerous to practice without like a very skilled teacher, like like Kundalini meditation, which isn't a Theravada Buddhist method, but I have read repeatedly that Kundalini meditation can be dangerous if you're practicing it on your own, just out of a book or with some amateur who is not a very good teacher trying to guide you because they learned it in a book or something. Yeah, you can, different things can happen, up to, really serious like mental dysfunction, maybe even death. But that's maybe I shouldn't like say something that would scare people away from meditation. I mean, if you're doing a relatively simple, straightforward meditation, which pretty much all Theravada Buddhist meditations are, then you're doing okay. And if you're in the presence of a really wise person like Neem Karoli Baba, like I was saying, maybe this question was inspired by some statements I made in the previous Q&A where I was talking about how Neem Karoli Baba, during his darshans, people would be all sitting around him like as an audience, just hanging out with him, just picking up on his vibes and so forth. That some people would just spontaneously start going into deep meditative states, and he would send this kid or like the ashram sweeper to go and just pester them until they couldn't meditate anymore, just to bring them out of it because they just weren't ready for it yet. So, as a general rule, I mean, Dhamma will protect you. So I don't think there's anything really to be afraid of unless you're trying to go for some kind of weird esoteric stuff, like Aleister Crowley stuff or Kundalini stuff, that kind of thing. You could get into some murky, dark areas in your meditation, especially if you don't have a good guide. But as a general rule, if you start getting into a meditation that's too deep for you, that you're not ready for it yet, most people, like in Theravada Buddhism, they'll feel their ego start to dissolve, or they'll feel that they're not even breathing. Their breath has become so subtle that it feels like they're not breathing anymore. Then they'll just panic. If they're not ready for that yet, they'll just, they'll chicken out and just stop meditating. It'll snap them out of the meditation. So I guess I answered that one. So I'll just go on to Skuladin's next question here. Would you kindly explain the ethics in Fight Club? And that's kind of a weird question. That one kind of put me on the back heel, so to speak, because Fight Club is one of my favorite movies. It's really a good movie. But I mean, what are the ethics? I mean, it's sort of like Nietzsche or something. It's almost like anti-ethical. It's just, I mean, it's just sort of like a rebellion against this consumeristic modern society that castrates men and just removes the warrior hero mentality from men, which of course a lot of people nowadays would totally justify and say, yeah, we're better off getting rid of toxic masculinity. But yeah, I don't know how ethical that is. I mean, where is the ethics? I mean, there is some ethics in just being fearless. There is some emphasis on fearlessness and just enduring pain and just enduring pretty much everything, just facing it and just experiencing it to the full. Just like, putting the quick lime, I think that's what it is, or lie on the back of, yes, I guess it was lie. Just putting it on the back of your hand until it's just burning, your skin's just bubbling, and you have to be right there. It's like Tyler Durden keeps slapping the nameless, whatever his name was, as he's trying to go to his safe place. He's trying to imagine the cave with the penguin and all that. And Tyler Durden's just slapping him saying, be right here with the pain, So it's just like an independence of groupthink to some degree, although the space monkeys just kind of form their own groupthink in the movie. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just amoral. I think that's like largely the ethics of Fight Club is just sort of like an argument for a kind of masculine amorality, sort of like Bronze Age pervert or something. But I mean, you can tease out some real ethics, like fearlessness is definitely moral. Fear is immoral. Or just freedom. I mean, the social freedom, the freedom to do what you want, is inferior to mental freedom, but still it's better than being a slave. So yeah, like it's certainly not teaching ethics. I mean, you're not supposed to like pee into people's soup, you know? You just it's just not right. It's not ethical to do that. Although they were doing plenty of that in Fight Club, or worse than peeing into the soup. They were doing other things into the soup, especially the clam chowder. So yeah, it's kind of a weird question. I guess I should have like just contemplated Fight Club, maybe watched it again to really sort of work out the ethics of it, because I've never really considered Fight Club as like an ethical or moral movie. There's a certain philosophy to it, but it's more Nietzsche than Schopenhauer, definitely. So yeah, I guess I did my best to explain the ethics of Fight Club within the constraints of answering this as well as more than 40 other questions. So I will think about it. Maybe in another episode, maybe the next episode, I will have had some kind of Fight Club epiphany or something. But it is a good movie. I do advise any guy, especially, to watch the movie. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is also from Skuladin. And he says, oftentimes Myanmar has been completely excluded or information omitted in anything related to the Orient. I think quite a few people would probably just compare it to North Korea for lack of knowledge. What does the government even do over there? And what he says with regard to Myanmar being completely excluded or information omitted, I mean, probably most people in the West are completely oblivious to the fact that Myanmar is at present in a full-blown state of civil war. It's just the powers that be, the establishment, the globalist establishment, doesn't want you to be concerned with that. It'll distract you from Ukraine and Israel. Those are the two countries at war among several that they want you to be concerned about for various reasons. So the full-blown civil war going on in Myanmar right now is it's considered to be insignificant. People shouldn't even hear about it. But what does the government do? So that almost pretty much the whole time that I lived in Burma or Myanmar, it was under a military dictatorship. And the main purpose of the military dictatorship was to remain in power. I mean, that's the way a lot of companies are, governments. That's the way a lot of governments are. Increasingly in the West also. I mean, just look at what's going on in America now, where the front runner for president of the United States is just being persecuted. I mean, they're doing everything they can aside from assassination to destroy this guy. And it would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. I mean, before 2016 especially, I mean, even people on the left would think, I mean, that just couldn't happen in America. That happens in places like, El Salvador or something. That happens in Iran. It couldn't happen in America, but now it's happening in America. At least they haven't just given like a totally fake show trial and thrown him into prison. But maybe that's just because they know that there would be some real riots going on if that happened. Anyways, what does the government even do over there? It's like the top generals and some of the higher class colonels, they're just accumulating wealth and maintaining their power and, doing their best to keep I keep trying to say company, doing their best to keep I won't say the civilians, the subjects, not the citizens, but the subjects, just keep them under control, keep them from acting up, which lately has been failing because you've got civil war going on. But there's always been civil war to some degree around the edges, like in the non-Burmese ethnicities around the edges of Myanmar. There's been civil war going on since shortly after World War II. like the beginning of the Rambo movie, where he's actually in Myanmar fighting the Burmese government. And he did more to liberate Burma, at least temporarily, than Aung San Suu Kyi ever did. Just Rambo, that Rambo movie. I remember at the time that you could get 20 years in prison in Burma for being in possession of that Rambo movie. And there was another video that was going around that was also, you could be in prison for it. It was a picture of the military dictator's daughter's wedding, where she's just encrusted with diamonds. And then it kept like moving, it'd be shifting from that, showing the general's daughter encrusted with diamonds at her wedding, to what was going on right outside the venue where she got married. And it's just people living in abject poverty, squalor. So it's encrusted with diamonds, general's daughter encrusted with diamonds, dirt and squalor. Encrusted with diamonds, dirt and squalor. It just kept going back and forth between that. And I think that was like 15 or 20 years in prison also, if you were caught in possession of that particular video. But I mean, what is the government doing is, they're just doing whatever it takes for them to remain in power, and doing what they can to keep the country more or less going. I mean, their attempts at prosperity just fail miserably because they're more or less incompetent. But they do have China backing them up. So China backs up the military government of Burma, and in exchange, the military government in Burma is just selling large chunks of Burma to China, or at least they're gaining control over like copper mines and seaports and that sort of thing. A lot of Chinese melon fields in Burma now. So, I mean, what else do they do? I mean, they just do what little they can to keep the country going and for them to remain in power, and just enjoying their wealth. Aside from that, driving their Mercedes-Benz automobile, or having the chauffeur drive it for them. And just, there are some people in Burma, this is, I think it's a misunderstanding that in a third world country that everyone's poor. But that's not the case. In a third world country, you've got like 1% that's just filthy rich, and then pretty much everybody else is poor. And so that's the way it is in Burma. And most of the filthy rich people in Burma, at least at the times when I was living there, were either high-ranking military officials or close relatives of high-ranking military officials, plus just a few close friends of high-ranking military officials. But I mean, they got it set up that the money is being channeled to them. Like, somebody was telling me, I started hanging out with Western expats for a little while before I left Burma. And I heard a lot of weird inside stuff that you'd only hear from like Western expats, where there was one guy, people just rushed in when the military government supposedly ended, like around 2011, which mainly meant that the generals just changed out of their uniforms and into civilian clothes. But like, in order to build some kind of buildings, that you had to buy the materials from this one company in Rangoon. It didn't matter where in Burma you were going to build the building. You had to buy the materials from this one person or this one company in Rangoon that was closely affiliated with at least one Burmese general. And then, of course, they're making the profits, and they make it illegal to buy the same stuff from someone who's actually close to where the building is. They just do that kind of stuff. So I guess I answered that question probably in more detail than was necessary. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Mama. And Mama says, do you totally believe in reincarnation? And then in parentheses, it says here, I saw a YouTube video in which a Buddhist monk says there's 100% proof that it is real based on the evidence of a 9-year-old Thai girl who remembered her past life. So, do I totally believe in reincarnation? I can't say that I totally believe in anything. That belief is a kind of delusion. Belief is thinking that you know something that you don't really know. Because if you really knew it, you'd know it and not just believe it. So, as I've been saying, I mean, there's no way of proving certain things. I mean, how are you going to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is reincarnation? People that are wiser than me believe in reincarnation. Like Ram Dass, he used to say he had no doubt at all in reincarnation, that, you know, he had seen enough proof for himself that he had no doubts at all. But I'm more skeptical than Ram Dass. I'm more skeptical than most religious people. And so, I mean, it's a working hypothesis, but even though I accept the working hypothesis, I don't think it necessarily happens the way the books say it happens. You know, Orthodox Theravada says it happens one way. The Tibetan Book of the Dead says it happens another way. Hinduism will say that it works in another way. And so there is something to it, but I don't think it's necessarily just the way books explain it. So with regard to Buddhist monk says that there's 100% proof that it's real, there's really not 100% proof that anything is real. And I mean, there is evidence of children who remember past lives who can come up with information about this past life that can be verified. But even that, I mean, it could just be like a kind of remote viewing, like clairvoyance or something that could explain it also. Or who knows? I mean, some cases probably are just fraudulent, but I don't think all of them are. But Ian Stevenson, I mentioned him earlier, he wrote a number of books on evidence, empirical evidence for reincarnation, and it consisted largely of children that believe that recalled a previous existence and could like give details that could then be verified, that sort of thing. But even that isn't just absolute proof. So I do think that there is something to the idea of reincarnation. I do not believe that it's when you're dead, you're dead. It's just you poof into oblivion. But it is primarily like an intuitive thing, a thing that I accept on the authority of people I acknowledge as wiser than me, like Neem Karoli Baba back there on the thing, and just Buddhist sages in general, for that matter. And what else was I going to say with regard to that? Intuition, appeals to authority. I mean, I have read a couple of Ian Stevenson's books, so I've seen that evidence also. My father, who claimed to remember past lives. So I pretty much believe in reincarnation. That would be my first pick with regard to explaining what happens to us after we die. You know, it is my working hypothesis, but I really cannot bring myself to totally believe in anything. That I mean, belief itself is ultimately it's all within a samsaric context of conventional truth, and so ultimately it's not going to be true knowledge anyway, like I've already mentioned while answering a previous question. But I am inclined to endorse it as likely. But of course, who can prove it one way or the other? I mean, nobody can really prove that when you're dead, you're dead. So anyways, I'm going to go on to the next question, which is the very last question. My golly, we're well under 3 hours. And this is from Arain. And Arain says, because you led such an extremely strict ascetic life in Burma, do you ever feel like a completely different person since you disrobed? Or do you feel like the same person despite everything changing so drastically? Well, sometimes I am struck by just how different my life is now than from, say, 15 or 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago for that matter. And in a way, it does feel like I'm somewhat of a different person. I'm not a completely different person, but I am somewhat of a different person. Some of that is that I'm not a monk anymore. But then again, I mean, to some degree, I've just fallen back on layperson's habits that I developed before I was a monk. So in a way, I've sort of reverted back to being like a layperson again, like I was before I was a monk, but also I'm getting older. And so just getting older is making me feel different. I'm changing, towards being a different person just from getting older. So it's just impermanence in general is causing me to feel different than I used to feel. But I mean, obviously, from the conventional point of view, I'm still the same person, more or less. It's just that certain aspects of my behavior and my perceptions have changed. But so, yeah, I mean, I am obviously different than I was 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, I'm obviously very different from when I was 6 months old, too. So, I mean, everything is impermanent and it's just sort of a flux. It's like who you consider yourself to be is always changing a little bit, but some of the changes are fairly radical and obvious, and sometimes it does kind of strike me that wow, this is very different than how I used to be. But I'm still called Punyo a lot of the time. So I guess that's it. I guess I answered all the questions. So if you have any questions, especially if they're not on like controversial subjects that might get me a strike on YouTube, then feel free to ask questions, especially if they're not joke questions, like a certain person tends to ask. If they're in good faith, you actually want to know the answer to the question, then, and you think that I can answer it, maybe, like questions about Buddhism, philosophy in general, meditation, monasticism, Burma, myself personally, etc., then yeah, feel free to ask in the comments below. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. If you have access to the my Subscribe Star channel, you can ask them there. And check the URL links if I am at present allowed to display my URL links on YouTube. You can find them on Rumble or Bitchute or on an old video of mine anyway. And be happy.